Kowal, as I mentioned. I write science fiction and fantasy, both in novel and short fiction. Short form, I've won 2 Hugos for my short fiction. And I also am an audiobook narrator and a professional puppeteer and a member of the Writing Excuses podcast. Whoa. And I go by Mary Robinette because I am that Southern.
Hi, my name is Laura McGill. I write both short and long fiction. My short fiction is in the UVU anthology, and I'm here, but I'm primarily a long fiction author, but I'm here because I love Ray Bradbury and raised myself on Ray Bradbury, so that's what I bring to the table today.
Okay, I think we have our own mic. I'm Darci Stone, and I was last year's grand prize winner for Writers of the Future, so apparently I can write a short story. I'm also married to Eric James Stone, who is a local author, and I don't know why he's not on this panel, because he's really good at short stories. And then I teach high school math and science, so I love math and science.
Right. My name's Maddie Murdock, and I write short and long fiction, but mostly I work as a freelance game content writer, and so I have worked for Fantasy Flight Games, most notably on their Legend of the Five Rings brand, and so I have a novella that just came out last year, which is really fun. So I write lots of short fiction for gaming types of projects. And I also teach. I teach freshmen and sophomores in college, and I generally use Ray Bradbury's work quite often. So I've taught him as both a subject and as a kind of creative writing example to many students. So that's why I'm on this.
Great. So, have you had an opportunity to think of questions? Excellent. Thank you.
Why do you love Ray Bradbury so much?
So the question was, why do you love Ray Bradbury so much? Who's got another one?
How did Ray Bradbury influence other science fiction short writers?
Okay. Great. How did Bradbury influence people?
Can you add to that one, continue to influence, or if it's waxing or waning?
Okay. Great. Influence continues. Mm-hmm.
I would like to know how I can improve my short fiction by reading Bradbury.
Okay.
What makes him different from other short story authors?
What makes him different? Okay.
So I've heard that short fiction used to be the stepping stone that you needed to take to get into publishing longer fiction. That seemed to be certainly the case back in Bradbury's time. Is that still the case? And if so, how do we go about doing that?
Okay. So short fiction as a stepping stone, and has that changed, and how do we do it?
How to balance world building in a short story within the length.
Okay. World building in short fiction. Anybody else?
What kind of promises should you deliver on in short SF?
Promises to deliver in short SF. These are great questions. Anybody else have something that you are? Yes.
I'll say audience expectations when it comes to readers reading short fiction.
Audience expectations.
Or readers' expectations.
Right.
Just the audience.
Got it. Yeah.
Given the changing in the markets, do you think Bradbury's method of a story a week and then putting it out to different people to try to get published, is that still something that's doable given the number of markets there are to be published in?
Okay, so given changes in markets, is Bradbury's strategy of a story a week still a viable strategy? Okay. Like, I don't need to spell Bradbury every time. If I just write down B, I would know. I would figure that out on the last question. Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
Are there any common themes that seem to permeate Bradbury's short fiction?
Okay, common themes. Awesome. So we're going to start off, and I'm going to have Laura actually talk to us a little bit about where Bradbury, the kind of place he occupies in the pantheon. And then we're going to drill into these as we go.
It's tempting to think that Ray Bradbury has such a big impact on the pantheon because of sheer quantity. Because the quantity is impressive. I received a book of 100 of Ray Bradbury's best short stories. I thumbed through it and I'm like, oh hey, it doesn't have that one I really like. The one I really like wasn't even considered to be one of his top 100 best. But beyond just how much he produced, it's how weirdly he produced. For many people, I know that he was something of a gateway drug to more zany science fiction, because science fiction has a history of starting out, you know, in some ways very scientific, a little bit dry, but very straightforward, and there's physics in it, and you'd better follow along. And Ray Bradbury was just fun and strange and contradictory, and I think that he was this influence for weirdness, and I support that so entirely. What you will find is that not only his short fiction, but also his book, Zen and the Art of Writing, you'll find that a lot of people, that was one of the earlier manuals on how to write. So people who are now writing how to write manuals grew up reading Zen and the Art of Writing from Ray Bradbury, and they'll often acknowledge, like, I agree with his point, or I disagree with his point, but you almost always have to acknowledge his point, whatever it is. You will love him.
Awesome. So let's actually start there with, why do we as panelists love Ray Bradbury? What is it for us specifically that calls to us about him? Darci, go ahead.
I think for me, it's the emotion. Like, you can't read one of his stories without finishing that last line and feeling something powerful. If you're looking for like a really happy, lift me up kind of feeling, you may want to avoid Bradbury, because he tends to be really good at the, you know, deeper, disquieting emotions, but every one of his stories packs a very powerful emotional punch, and that's what I love about him.
My favorite thing is the prose, because it feels like you're reading poetry, but it's not. It's science fiction. And you realize, like, space can be so beautiful, not just with emotions, but just with descriptions. I remember reading one of my favorite short stories from him. I can't remember the title, but he was talking about astronauts getting launched into space like a handful of pebbles getting thrown down a well. And I was just like, oh, that is such a cool way to describe such a horrifying, you know, situation. But it's apt. We get it immediately, and I just fell in love with just the way that he would describe everything and anything. It just made you feel really immersed, and it made you feel like space was a place you wanted to go to, even though it was horrifying.
Oh, why I love him? His range. As an author, I can't beat it, because it sparked so many ideas, from a short story on 6 men who were the same size and decided that they were all going to go in and buy a suit together, to something so bizarre as, no, I won't, that's too complicated, to giant spiders in space. I'll use that one. His range of ideas is very inspiring to me.
Well, and also I want to say that not just Ray Bradbury, but short fiction in general, I love that it's short. You know, you can sit down in a few minutes and get through the entire story, and that's very satisfying, you know, if you don't have time to commit to an epic fantasy series.
So, Laura, you mentioned that if you are wanting to read something that's kind of uplifting, or no, that was Darci who said that Bradbury is perhaps not the right place to go, but that he always packs an emotional punch. So, what are some of the common themes? Because even though he has this very broad range, I do feel like there are things that he tends to revisit, that there are ideas that he tends to look at again and again. Longing, loss, a reminder that I will riff until one of you starts to talk. Great, thank you.
Okay, I think for me, one of the really most beautiful things in Ray Bradbury is that he gets you to fall in love with the ordinary. So whether that's like the dew in the grass, or whether that's just like somebody's grandmother, like it's so plain, but he portrays it in such a way that is just so meaningful. And so, yeah, by the end of a short story, you come to love that thing regardless, or you love that person, or you love that situation, or you love that relationship. And so I feel like for me that's something that he tries to do in every single piece of work, which is fall in love with life. And he constantly says that in many of the interviews that he gave, which is, I want people to just love life for what it is, because he's fallen in love with life, and he wants other people to do that as well.
And I think he's very good at a feeling of loss. If you think of the scene in Castaway when Wilson floats off and he has to give up Wilson, and you just have that overwhelming feeling of loss for a volleyball, right? But I think several of Ray Bradbury's stories, it's that same feeling of just profound loss for either people or the past or things that are precious to you, and now they're gone.
Going off of what you said, making the mundane magical, but he makes it magical in a way that is both joyful and terrifying, and I think we see this most when he writes about children. Because, yes, they are children in peril, and things that are wonderful and amazing happen to them, and also things that make you go, oh no, but do you remember being a kid and actually believing that you were going to die from this totally ordinary and mundane thing? And he recaptures that in a way that was very vivid and real to me, and you see that again and again.
So let's move on to his influences. I have said that my Lady Astronaut books are an homage to Ray Bradbury. And I know that there are a lot of other people out there. There's films and other things. Where are some of the influences that you see, places where you're like, either you know that someone was influenced by him, how he influences your own work, or resonances that you see kind of trickling down from him? Obviously, oh, go ahead, Darci.
I think, like, if you're looking for hard sci-fi, that's not what Bradbury did. But instead, he kind of just caught the wonder of asking the question, like, you know, what is going to happen to society when we do have rocket ships and we're traveling to Mars, and asking some of the simpler questions of, you know, what are the types of people that are going to be interested in going on these expeditions? What are the risks they face? What are the parallels with our own history? He draws a lot of parallels with the American West and the people there. And so I think just being an author that explored science fiction without letting himself get bogged down in the science half of it has been very influential for other authors.
If I may, his thoughts on time travel. I see a lot of similar patterns that maybe he did not invent, but he certainly popularized. The butterfly effect. Mm-hmm. That was a big one. You go back in time to hunt a dinosaur, you step on a butterfly, you come back, and you don't realize it, but your timeline is now darker for it. And that was an idea from physics that he pulled and made popular, and it became a bigger idea, and we see it, chaos theory in Jurassic Park. You know, he's a starting point for a lot of really interesting things.
I don't know if there is a direct relationship or not, but I would not be surprised. Many of his short stories have a very, like, Twilight Zone feel. And so if you have ever enjoyed watching, you know, the old Twilight Zones, I don't know whether they copied him or he copied them, but there's definitely a lot of crossover in just the types of themes they explore and the feeling you get by the end of the episode.
And how do we think that he is different from other short fiction writers? So we've talked about some of the things, the influences that he's had on people, and some of the things that he does really well. But when you're looking at short fiction writers from his era, what are some of the things that, like Darci mentioned, that he writes science fiction stories without worrying so much about the science aspect of it? There's his use of language. Is there anything else that kind of is a definitive, like, this is Bradbury and could not be anyone else?
I think one thing that is very distinctive of his style is his use of punctuation, because he will write a sentence that is like a full half-page long, and every single part of that sentence needs to be there. And I think that, you know, he's very good at just playing with the language and how it sounds and what emotions really can be portrayed in just kind of mixing up the lengths of the way that we talk. Because it is almost like he's trying to communicate an emotion that can't be captured in any other way except for by a really, really, really long sentence. And so I think that's something that's very distinctive of him.
Yeah, I would agree. I use him when I'm teaching people how to narrate. Because of the rhythmic qualities of his language, it feels like something that is meant to be spoken aloud. He's got a wonderful use of repetition. In The Fruit at the Bottom of the Bowl, there's this line, he looked at his hands and he looked at the floor, and he looked at his hands, he looked at sorry, I've got this backwards. He looked at his hands, he looked at the large room around him, and he looked at the body lying on the floor. And that use of looked over and over again, like a lot of writers would shy back from that repetition, and he embraces it.
Because he was some of my earliest science fiction influences, I unintentionally copied him a great deal early on and got dinged for it often. Often, because he does things like begin a scene with narration or with dialogue, and you don't know anything about the scene, it's just a white room. He would do things like the repetition, and people were like, oh, break up your words, use different kinds of words, and all sorts of things, but when he does it, you don't care. That's the difference between him and someone who's just starting out.
Well, and I think we often as writers talk about how, you need the beginning, the middle, the end, you need a full arc. And there are several of his stories that aren't even what you would consider a story. Like, there's not really a plot, and yet they're very powerful. Like, I can think of a few of them that are just ordinary people just talking to each other for a few pages of text, and then the story's over. And yet he manages to make it powerful enough that you remember this story, years later, even though you couldn't really describe to someone like what happens in it.
I think another thing that he does really well is that none of his stories really have like a hard villain who's like super evil and will do everything evil imaginable just because they're wicked. I think he definitely creates characters that are very...
the one with the baby.
I'm sure there's an exception or two considering his body of work. But it does feel like a lot of his villains are still people. They're not caricatures of villainy. And so I feel like he tries to create casts of characters that have a depth and breadth to them that justifies their actions quite a bit. And so we understand like that that's a human being and not just a cardboard cutout of a demon or something like that.
Well, and it's funny that you asked, like, how would you recognize him if you picked him up and, it didn't have his name on it? Because as I was preparing for this panel, I was rereading some of his stories, and I was thinking to myself, wow, this really reminds me of that one short story they made us read in junior high, but I don't remember who wrote it. And then as I was going through, like, his bibliography, I, sure enough, stumbled across that was his story. I didn't remember that was, his name, because in junior high I was paying attention, but the reason it reminded me of him is because it was him. So he is, in fact, a distinct voice.
Yeah. Well, and also reading his work, and this makes sense after you learn how quickly he writes his work, you feel breathless reading through it. Some things are meant to be, some prose is meant to be savored very slowly. For me, Ray Bradbury is not a savor slowly, it's a rush through, and at the end, oh my goodness, what just happened to me? I don't know, but it's a half hour later and I'm late. And that's the feeling that he very consistently evokes, and you can find that so often with him. Without his name on it, you'd still know.
So let's talk about his process. So he wrote on an IBM Selectric. He wrote a story a week, and he would just put in the typewriter paper and he would go. So how much, one of the people in the audience wanted to know is that still viable? Is that something that people can still do, and are there enough markets? Is that something that is, a relic of the past?
I'm not sure about the current market, but I do have something to say about his particular writing process, which was that he, in a lot of his interviews, would always say that his stories were dictated to him by his own characters. And so his characters would come and talk to him in his mind and say, like, write this thing and put it down on the paper. And so he would be constantly, like, having questions to his characters, like, why do you want me to say this? Or what are you even doing? And so he never really took credit for the stories as they came out. And he did say, he's like, I think lots of people think I'm crazy for being this way, but he's like, that's really my writing process. And I think he did take his entire career to really enhance that way of writing, because not everyone can do that.
Speaking to his process, I love that it is both like, we revere it as this deeply artistic, it was dictated to him, he writes in such a rush because he's such a genius, but at the same time, he wrote in such a rush because he was poor, So it's the perfect blend of this is a job. You work hard at your job, but at the same time, this is an art, and you need to acknowledge and nurture that art. And just reading about his process, I don't write the same way that he does, but his philosophy is still very inspiring to me. And again, I do recommend Zen and the Art of Writing by Ray Bradbury, especially if you're interested in short fiction.
I could be wrong about this, but I think in the modern publishing world, like if you want to make a living as an author, you're going to have a very hard time doing that if all you write is short fiction, just because there's not as big of a market as there used to be, and people are not willing to pay as much for it.
You keep going. I've got a thing.
Okay. And so, while it definitely is good at helping you hone your skills, I wouldn't necessarily quit your day job planning to write a short story a week and then make, a living off that. And along those lines, I do think the skill set for writing short fiction is different than a full-length novel. Like, I know my husband loves to write short fiction, and he's very good at it, in my opinion. But he has a hard time doing a full-length novel. Like, it's just a different skill set, and so it doesn't always cross over. Just, you can polish the short story to perfection. That won't necessarily help you write your first breakout novel. And I think you can even see this with Ray Bradbury, because how many full-length novels is he famous for? And it's not hundreds.
Two. Yeah, two. Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit, yeah. So the... What?
Dandelion wine.
Dandelion wine.
Not famous.
Something wicked this way comes.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So, but I think one thing to point out about that and about the idea of short fiction as a stepping stone to writing novels is that the landscape has very different. When you said, this is where I was like, wait a minute, when you said people aren't willing to pay as much as they paid Ray Bradbury, actually they are. Ray Bradbury was also paid 5 cents a word. But that's a very different pay rate.
In the 1940s.
Yeah, in the 1940s than it is, in the 20-teens. It is, so one of the things when he was writing, and one of the strategies was that you did crank out as many short stories as you could, because short stories paid more than novels. And the reason writing short stories was a stepping stone to write novels, and that has stuck, is because you needed to have a significant body of work in order for a publisher to be willing to lose money on you by publishing a novel. So novels were seen as kind of the vanity project, the labor of love, whereas that has flipped because now you get paid more for writing a novel. So if you can write one, then you do. Just as a quick note, Jim C. Hines did a survey of people who had run first novels, whether you had written short fiction or whether you just wrote a novel and submitted it and that was your first thing. 50-50. Doesn't matter. Write the thing that you love. So with that in mind, unless one of you wants to talk about how the stepping stones and all of that, let's talk about specifically how to improve through reading Ray Bradbury. There's a number of different things that we can look at within that kind of umbrella. Like, how does he handle world building?
Not world building specifically.
Just anything about improving through reading.
Something that, this is the opposite of your question, I apologize, but it's something Ray Bradbury did that I don't see as much. Styles have changed, is his endings. Have you noticed that his endings now are different than some endings in short fiction that you will see, where I feel that short fiction now, it doesn't leave me quite so, what? He will just stop the story when he feels that it is done, and he feels that he has left you on the correct emotional note. I do not feel that you can get away with that anymore. I am happy to be contradicted, but that has been my reading experience. So do what he does, except when you don't.
I think part of that is also just with regards to his world building idea. In a lot of his short fiction, he's not really concerned with necessarily world building, like taking time to do that. He just kind of throws you into the world as it is. And then you kind of just pick up the pieces as you go. And so it's kind of like you're just, you're not exactly sure what to expect. You're like, okay, this is science fiction. I'll keep my mind open. But you just kind of, again, are kind of playing catch up, gathering the clues as the characters live in the setting already. They're not really concerned with saying like, this is the culture and this is the time period and this is, our monetary system or anything like that. You're just kind of gleaning as you go. You may miss some things, but really it's because it's character driven and it's emotion driven, not necessarily like world driven.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I think he does very well is his stories are very simple. I think a lot of writers nowadays are like, how am I going to pack this really convoluted, complex, interweaving plot into a short story? And the answer is don't. Like, that's not what short stories are for. His stories usually had just one basic idea, one basic plot arc, and that was the entire story. So they were very simple. If you get on Wikipedia and just read through summaries of his works, many of the summaries are only 2 or 3 sentences. Now, does that do the story justice? No. But the fact that they could summarize it in so few words kind of shows you how simple the story was that he was telling, but he told it so well that it would stick with you anyway.
Dialogue, I feel that that's his big strength, and if you want to improve, that would be a place to go for a good example.
Can you expand on what about dialogue?
He can carry a story with just a higher ratio of dialogue to everything else than anyone else that I've ever seen. He can start you in a scene with just dialogue and you don't feel lost because he is a master. I wouldn't say that the way his characters speak would be considered natural today because he was writing in a different time, but you feel that you know the characters very quickly and the beats are very distinct so that even if I took off Samuel said, Dr. Smith said, I would know who was speaking.
So I think one of the things that you're underlining there is something we talked about earlier, which is that he's very good with rhythm, and rhythm is often dictated by punctuation, which we brought up earlier. And again, this is coming from the audiobook land. He understands where to place the punctuation because that tells you where to pause. That tells us where we pause. And with the world building, again, I think the thing that we're talking about is that the thing that Mary said was that the characters, the interaction of the characters in the world, that he just drops you in and you go through it as you live, which is a way to approach that when you're writing short fiction, rather than trying to lay out all of the world building, have the characters live in the world and let the readers discover that through. Something I find that Ray Bradbury does is that he leaves room for you to extrapolate. And I've also found that short fiction readers are more willing to extrapolate than novel readers are. Novel readers kind of want a little bit more hand-holding, I would say.
Yes, and there are several of his stories that are open-ended technically. I mean, he kind of leaves you suspecting what happens, and it's usually something not good. But very rarely does he actually come out directly and be like, and this is what happened next, the end. Like, he just leaves you thinking that you probably know what happened next, but it's left to your imagination.
J.K. Rowling's epilogue, this is the opposite of that.
Yes.
I also think it's interesting that one of the themes that shows up in several of his stories is this idea of censorship. That in the future they're going to burn books, they're going to ban books, especially books that he believes are like, they're not morally uplifting or they're not edifying to the public. And it's interesting to me because many of the stories he wrote did border on the macabre, like they were strange and unsettling, and like one of the authors that he often mentioned as being censored was Edgar Allan Poe, which I think much of his style was similar to Edgar Allan Poe, especially the emotions he was evoking. And so I think he knew as he was writing this, he's like, many people are going to find this unsettling, but I'm going to write what I want to write. And I do find that, admirable that, he saw a future where the books he wrote were going to be banned for being non-uplifting, but he wrote them anyway.
All right, I'm going to tell you a quick story, and Mary will stop me if it goes too long.
Yeah.
Okay. I convinced a group of nice church ladies to read Fahrenheit 451 for book groups. And the more, yes, I should not have attempted this. But the moral that they took away from this was like, oh yeah, society became so bad because they had so many bad, fluffy things, and therefore we should censor things that aren't good for us. And I'm like, wait, you read 451 and you came away from this with a pro-censorship stance, and I'm like, be nice to the nice church ladies. And so, but it wasn't until I had to defend my position that I realized how necessary the macabre is for us, and how necessary and how we grow through the strange, and how we grow in sophistication and compassion through exposure to bizarre and fringe cases, and what would happen if the world was terribly twisted in this way, and how is that good for, frankly, our souls to be exposed to things that are dark and ugly and weird.
So do you think that he signposts that he makes those promises clearly to the reader, like from the get-go, or do you think that that is something that he unfolds as the story progresses? And in general, what sort of promises should we be making to readers? Yes, I know. So I feel like one of the things that he is very good at is setting up a tonal quality to stories, which tells you a little bit about the mood that you're going to be in. And that's something that I find very appealing in short fiction, that initial tonal landscape. Do you have, yeah.
Well, I do think, after you've read enough Bradbury, you kind of know what to expect. But even that being said, some of his stories are completely innocuous. You get to the end and there's no disturbing twist. It's just a slice of pie, right? And then other ones, you think it was a slice of pie until you get to the last few sentences, and then you're like, oh my goodness, what did I just read? And so, even for someone that, has read a lot of him, you continue to be surprised by his stories, not in a way that you feel betrayed, but in a way that makes you want to come back and keep reading more, because you're never quite sure what you're going to get. I can only think of maybe 3 of his stories that I've read that had what you'd consider a happy ending, but the fact that there were 3 of them, you never know when you start the next one. Will this one have a happy ending? Because it might. And so it just keeps you reading, wanting, to find out what happens next.
I think, as far as promises go, I think and we've kind of mentioned this before, I think he's really good at just making you feel satisfied. And so I think in short fiction, that's something really important, realizing, maybe you have a word limit or a page limit, or, you are restricted by just the length of short fiction. And so I think the promise to the reader is, you are presenting some type of situation, some type of complication, some type of problem, and it will be resolved by the end of this. There's no more. Once the word count is out, you might be, asking yourself questions, but you will be given enough tools to solve this problem by the end. And all of the pieces are there. That's it.
Do we have any follow-up questions from the audience? Yeah.
On the subject of repetition, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You have all apparently agreed that it works when Ray Bradbury does it. I feel like I have an idea of why it works, but I have never been paid for any of my fiction writing, so I could be totally wrong. So, do any of you, think you know why it works when Bradbury does it and not necessarily when somebody else tries it?
Well, I'm thinking of the sentence that you started with. He looked at this, he looked at that, he looked at this, and then he compulsively cleaned the house so long that he ended up getting caught for the murder. Unless I'm thinking of it. Yeah, that's the one. He saves it for when it matters. He did not use that for, he looked at this, he looked at that, he looked at this, and then he did the dishes. No, it was used at the time when it would have the biggest impact.
Yeah, I think your language choices should always tie into what's happening in your story and be building your story. Like, anytime you're throwing it in just because it's a cool literary device, you're probably headed in the wrong direction. But if it naturally builds the mood or what, you know, the feeling that you're trying to create, to have that repetition, to have that alliteration, to use choppy sentences or long sentences that take up the entire page, it just needs to organically blend in with the story that you're trying to tell.
And I think as far as what organically blends into the story means, it means like, do you notice obviously that it's happening, or are you just kind of so immersed in the story or the character or in the situation that you almost don't notice until you take a few steps back and you realize, oh, that's how this sentence has been structured. So it's not necessarily like a distraction, it's just it's facilitating your experience. So I think the moment it does become maybe a little overhanded or heavy-handed, or the moment that it does become blatantly apparent that that's what you're doing, then I think that's not a very good use of repetition.
So I'm going to jump out of Moderator and into this. One of the things that Bradbury does, and this sentence is a really good example of it, he looked at his hands and he looked at the large room around him and he looked at the body lying on the floor. There's only one adjective in that, the large room around him. What he does with his language is he uses it very specifically to focus you. And when he chooses to ornament something, he is choosing it because he wants you to linger on that thing just a little bit longer. And because what happens in that story is that he cleans the room, the large room around him. That is drawing attention to the fact that for him, in that moment, even though that's the middle of that sentence, that is actually important to him. And then he's got this thing, the body lying on the floor, which is disrupting the room. And so that's one of the things that he's doing with the repetition. He's using it very deliberately. It's and I would be willing to bet that if you were alive and we asked him about it, he'd be like, I did that? That's really cool. Because he's doing it, he's writing so much, but that is the effect that is happening. And so when you're adding these ornaments, you want to be thinking about, do I want to be focusing the reader's attention here? Am I using this repetition because I want to focus the reader, or because, as you said, it's a cool literary device? We have 5 minutes. Yes?
I'd like you guys to talk a little bit about Bradbury's ability to create this stage that is, quite fantastical, and yet to have a profoundly human drama unfold that with emotions that are readily identifiable. I remember teaching All Summer in a Day to 7th graders.
That's the one I read in junior high.
Yeah,
that was
after a terrible
the
bullying
Venus
incident,
ring.
and what that meant to those kids. But I know he does this a lot, so if you guys could talk a little bit more about how he does that.
I'm emotionally recovering from you mentioning that story.
Yeah,
We're all
me too.
reading together, actually.
Do you want to jump in? Because I think that for me the thing that he does is, he uses language to paint a sense of wonder, but he is so good at tapping into specifically what it means to be a child. And for me, the things that what he is doing is that it is through what the child notices, and it is through the child's visceral reaction to things, and that it is that it relates to something Connie Willis actually said when she was talking about the difference between mimetic fiction and science fiction and fantasy, in that in mimetic fiction you need the character to have an extraordinary reaction to very ordinary events in order to move the story forward. And that in science fiction, You have extraordinary events, which allows the character to have very ordinary reactions. And I think that that is, for me, the key to what Bradbury does. That the characters are having very ordinary human reactions that we would have in that scenario.
The stakes are very personal in that story, and again, still recovering just from you mentioning it. Oh gosh, because he makes it very clear what being outside on that day means. What being outside on that day means to a little girl. And you are so invested in the question of whether or not she gets to go outside. This is not the fate of the world. Nothing in her life actually changes if she doesn't get to go outside, or if she does or doesn't. But for her, it's so personal and it matters so much. And he builds up the backstory of why she needs this so much. And it's a small story, but we remember it forever.
Yeah, along those lines, like you mentioned earlier, that he doesn't have like a big villain in his stories, he also doesn't usually have a protagonist in the traditional sense. Like, there's not a hero in his stories, and they're not epic. You know, there aren't huge battles between civilizations. It's usually just ordinary people in unusual future circumstances, and then we just kind of follow this, the strong emotions that he can evoke just for ordinary people. It is part of what makes it powerful, because ordinary people can relate to it.
So we are out of time. I'm going to have my panelists tell you one Ray Bradbury story that they feel like this is the one that you must read. For me, it is There Will Come Soft Rains. Oh, There Will Come Soft Rains is post-apocalypse. It's a beautiful story, and you need to know nothing about it. Just read it.
This isn't my favorite emotionally, but I do think it's important for your sci-fi education. It's the one I mentioned. Just Google Ray Bradbury Butterfly Effect, and you'll find the title.
That one's A Sound of Thunder.
Oh, yes, you're right. It is Ray Bradbury, A Sound of Thunder. If you ever intend to write science fiction, or if you ever intend to write time travel, this is part of your time travel education.
And I'm going to mention the one that was mentioned in the back. It's called All Summer in a Day. And it's just a very powerful story, just about some ordinary school kids that live on Venus, and that's all I'm going to say.
If you're really interested in like the twist ending, like you get to the end of the story and then suddenly you realize like the ramifications of the entire thing, I would definitely recommend this story called Kaleidoscope, and it's about astronauts whose rocket explodes and then what happens once they're launched into space.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. We'll hopefully see you over at the signing.